I'm from a very small town in the Patagonian desert, so in a small valley between the mountains and the desert. And somehow I decided to be an artist for some reason. But I never sort of had an idea about art that was very classical. So my arrival was straight into contemporary art. And this has always been something that whenever I say it seems very puzzling. So this lecture that I prepared also gave me an opportunity to try to understand why I decided to become an artist. This is how I used to look at this man from this perspective when I was a child. This is like the main roundabout in the town. And I was completely obsessed by this sculpture. This was the first sculpture that I've ever seen because we don't have a museum or a gallery or anything. And I really wanted to get to him, but it was quite high. So one day when I was 7, I tried to climb this pedestal. And I fell and I broke my wrist. And this was my first encounter with public sculpture. There were other examples of public art when I was growing up. And these were, the first time that I saw one of these figures, it was in Neuquén, which is again this city across the river. And it was a picture of a pregnant woman. It was just a silhouette, and it had been traced on paper. And I asked my mom why there was a drawing hanging in the street. And she said it was a way to signal a desaparecido, which is a person who was disappeared by the military dictatorship in which I grew up until 1983. So basically, whenever you saw around town a picture of a silhouette of a person, it would mean that person had disappeared, and very often they had the name inside. I didn't know this was an artwork. It took me years. It wasn't until I went to art school that I realized that this was an artwork. The artwork was called a siluetazo, and it's a graphic event. The artists that organized this event didn't call it art. They called it a graphic event. And it took place on the 21st of September of 1993, so it was towards the end of the regime. And they got a bunch of people together, and they went to the Mayo Square and produced these silhouettes, traced their own bodies. So they lent their body to the people that had disappeared and produced these silhouettes and plastered them around the Mayo Square. And then these became an image that people took on the rest of the country and started spreading it. The artists who initiated this event were Rodolfo Aguirre-Berry, Julio Flores, and Guillermo Quexel. So it's kind of amazing to me that one of the strongest images that were produced in this period of dictatorship were produced by artists, but they got to me without knowing that this was an artwork. And I don't think they even thought about it themselves. So these are pictures from that event. That's the way they sort of produce the silhouettes. So I guess there's another story about circles, which is still related to this period in Argentina, which is when I was growing up, except in that it was over the change of this period. When I started primary school, democracy came to Argentina, and this was obviously very important for everyone. And one of the things that happened was that we were taught modern mathematics, which the most pedestrian expression of modern mathematics is the Venn diagrams. And one of the reasons why my teachers were so obsessed with modern mathematics when I was growing up was because they couldn't teach it before. So during the period of dictatorship, people were not allowed to gather. If you wanted to make a gathering that was larger than a group of 8 people, you had to let the government know. and unofficial gatherings could be prosecuted under the umbrella of the national security law. And at the same time, they also removed modern mathematics and set theory from primary schools, because they assumed that if you don't give a model to someone in which to think how do people relate and how they're different, that maybe that thought couldn't exist outside that model. So I guess one of the things that I was exposed to as a child through Sesame Street and through set theory was the notion that abstraction mirrors the process of thought, and that it's also that there's a narrative to abstraction, which I think became quite important later on for me to know as an artist, and to try to understand that it's not only the shape of something, but it also is what happens around that shape and what happened before and what will happen afterwards that puts that shape into a context and sort of hopefully makes an artwork. But besides, public sculpture and television, the other thing I had exposure to when I was a child was theater. My grandma was an actress, and she then became a theater director. And in Patagonia in particularly, there's a tribe called the Onas, or the Selknams. They were first seen by white men in the 1500s. These people have produced also images that were immensely powerful for me. They were hunter-gatherers, so they roamed around, and they had a ceremony of initiation for young boys in which they would paint themselves in whale fat. And as you can see, it's not a very difficult stretch for me to have seen these images as highly theatrical. Another one of the theater directors, of course, that I was completely influenced by was Beckett, who also has a very interesting relationship to language. This next video, which you might want to play, it's called Not I.
Speechless infant in the home, no, out into this world, tiny little thing before its time, in a what? Girl, yes, tiny little girl, into this, out into this, before her time, God-forsaken hole, called, no matter, parents unknown, unheard of, he having vanished, thin air, no sooner buttoned up his breeches, she similarly, 8 months later, almost at the tick, so no love, spared that, no love such as normally vented on the speechless infant in the home, no, nor indeed for that matter, any of any kind, no love of any kind, at any subsequent stage, so, typical affair, nothing of any note took him.
And one of the other people that I heard about in this sort of academic art school, because I took sculpture lessons because I was interested in objects, and I thought I was going to experiment at least with some materials, was Brancusi. He is this Romanian sculptor, of course, who was based in France. And this is his better known works, I guess. That's Bird in Space, and that's the Infinite Column, which he essayed enormously in his studio, this shape. And so I'm coming back to this picture because the other picture was a crop. But I think one of the most interesting stories around Brancusi is Brancusi in his studio. As you may know, there's a replica of his studio in Paris. And the reason why they did it was because after a while, he became very interested in exploring the relationship between the sculptures. He became very interested in that sort of space between his sculptures. And he became so attached to them that he started to be too sad to sell them, to let them go. So he would make like plaster models. We can go back and see some of the plaster models behind him of the sculptures so that they would at least be physically represented when they left the studio. So in this space between things, artists like Sildo Meireles became very important to me. I guess the reason why I sort of relate somehow the space between sculptures in Brancusi and the way that Sildo thought of space and circulation is mostly through this work, which is part of his series called Inserciones en circuitos ideológicos, which means basically insertions in ideological circuits. So he stamped all these Coca-Cola bottles. This was in the time where you could return your Coca-Cola bottle. So you would, he would buy some Coca-Cola bottles and stamp very often phrases that were sort of contesting the power of the dictatorship at the time, and he would return them with this new information inside the bottles. And this is another Brazilian artist who it's kind of a strange case, and I guess I was fascinated by him, but also by what it means to put objects in a context. His name is Arthur Bispo do Rosario. It's unsure which year he was born, but they think it's 1909. We all know that he died in 1989. He was basically spent his life in a mental institution, and he produced an enormous body of work. And I guess his work is extremely problematic in the senses that it brings about this sort of idea of outsider art. But he's also become a very important Brazilian artist. There's a museum named after him. He was in the Venice Biennial. He had a solo show at the Show de Palm. And I guess this is a cape that he wore. He didn't make art for us, for any of us. He was making art for God. He was preparing to go to the afterlife. And this cape is a work that he worked on for years. And he was basically making this sort of catalogue of things that would be useful for him to have in the afterlife, and lists of names of people he wanted to take with him. But I think one of the things that is extremely striking to me, this is the interior of his cape, is that he was very often deprived of materials, and he would undo his own clothing and saw this name, like continue to embroider these names by sort of taking apart his own clothes. So I guess there's something about, like, having seen his work, about like making work with what you have, and the strength and poetry that brings about, that has been extremely influential. These are mummified objects. These are some more of his works. This says, maybe you can understand it from Italian because it's Portuguese. So, but it says, "How is it that I need to make a wall at the back in the backyard of my house?" Which I think is quite. So these are some of his ensemblages, and I guess it's kind of funny. This is a museum show by him. It's like I love this picture because it's obviously a bicycle wheel, and it makes you think about this other bicycle wheel. This is another artist on wheels, which is an image that somehow I just wanted to share with you because it's been etched in my mind since I saw it when I was in art school. Another way of surviving sculpture classes was I worked for 5 years in a duo with a dancer. And this is Rauschenberg performing his pelican dance. So it's kind of, it's always, at that point, it was always very nice to see sort of these artistic collaborations, because, you know, my friend was developing the choreographies, and I was working with objects that we were sort of, anyways, it was a long story, but this is, again, Merce Cunningham, another one of those that were quite important to me at the time, and his, you know, fruitful love and collaboration with someone like John Cage. So by that point, it was very easy from dance to, you know, get get into the habit of being studious about conceptual art. And then another one of the possibilities that I was faced with was to rethink about how images can work as languages. So that there is a way in which image making also operates, not, I wouldn't say exactly as language, but that there is a way in which images can carry certain meaning, and that maybe it is in that realm of the visual that we are sort of confined to explore that relationship between images and language. This is maybe not the most representative artist to have done this, but he was certainly very important to me. This is a work by Sigurdur Gudmundsson. And this is a paradox that has sort of, I think, I would say that it began what I could call my body of work, this decision on whether to go. So it's probably a good place for me to finish in. But I guess I wanted to finish with these two works, and this is one of the works by Sigurdur. He's caught between the weight of the stone and the lightness of the balloons, and I guess that that it sort of became a nice way of thinking about me, you know, of like this idea of getting close to sculpture and then falling from it.